In lesson 8.6, where we solve multiplication and division equations found on page 327 of our big book, our essential question is, how do you solve multiplication and division equations? You can use the properties of equality and inverse operations to solve multiplication and division equations. So, here we have the division property of equality. 2 times 6 equals 12. We know that to be true. If we decided to divide by 2 on this side, this crosses out, doesn't it? And becomes a 1. And then we still have the times 6 equals 12 divided by 2. So now we have 1 times 6, this is our 1, equals 6, because 12 divided by 2 equals 6. So 6 equals 6. So in other words, if you divide both sides of an equation by the same non-zero number, 2 in this case on both sides, the two sides will remain equal. In other words, they'll stay in balance, like we talked about at the beginning of this chapter. Everything has to stay in balance. Mai ran 14 laps around a track for a total of 4,200 meters. The equation 14d for the distance in meters, 14 laps, equals 4,200 can be used to find the distance d in meters she ran each lap. So in other words, she ran around 14 times, and the total amount that she ran in those 14 times was 4,200 meters. We want to know, so what is just one time around the lap then? What is that distance? Solve the equation and explain what the solution means. All right, so we're going to solve our multiplication equation to get d by itself, because we always want to isolate the variable. That's always the goal, get the variable by itself. You must undo the multiplication by 14. Dividing by 14 is the inverse operation, or the opposite. Dividing is the opposite of multiplication. Dividing by 14 is the inverse operation of multiplying by 14. So that's how we undo it. And in the end, we're going to make a 1, like we did up here. We're going to make a 1. So here's our equation. 14d equals 4,200. Use the division property of equality. We're going to divide both sides, not by 4,200. We want to isolate the variables. So we're going to divide both sides by 14, because we want to get d by itself. So you choose the number next to the variable and use the inverse operation to isolate it. All right, so now we divide, and we get, so we made a 1 here. 14 divided by 14 is 1. The d's left over, so we have 1 times d, so that's what this is right here. Now we have 4,200 divided by 14. I don't know this off the top of my head, so I'm going to do some margin work for the teacher. Let's see. My first guess is going to be 3, so let's times 3. 14 does not go into 4. It does go into 42. I'm guessing 3 times. So that's 12. Look at that, it's 42. So it's 3. And the 3 went over the 2 because I didn't divide into 4. I divided into 42. Bring down the 0. Bring down the 0. All right, so 4,200 divided by 14 is 300. Therefore, d equals 300, because 1 times d, using the identity property of multiplication, 1 times d is d. So now we know the distance. 1 time around, 1 time equals 300. She went 14 times around, and that equaled 4,200. All right, so write the equation. So now we're checking the solution to make sure we did our math right. So we're going to substitute 300 in for the D because that was our solution. So 14 times 300, do a little margin work. Let's see, that's 0, 0, 12, placeholder 0, 0, 0, 3. Look at that, looks like it's correct. So 14 times 300 is 4,200, which equals 4,200. So the solution means my ran 300 meters in each lap. So one time around was 300 meters. All right, let's take a look at the back side. So basically, today's lesson in a nutshell is use inverse operations to undo the operation going on next to the variable. Isolate the variable, make a 1. All right, n is multiplied by 2/3. Okay, so I'm sorry, we're supposed to solve this equation. 2/3 n equals 1/4. N is multiplied by 2/3. When it's next to the variable, the operation implied is multiplication. So divide both sides by 2/3 to undo the division. Just like we did on the last one, we divided by 14 to isolate the variable. Now, for a second here, we got to go back to a chapter 2 skill. Way back to 2.7. Because we are saying here that we're going to divide both sides by a fraction. So that means this side, in order to keep it balanced, would have to be the same, right? Remember in 2.7, we do not divide fractions. Instead, we use the multiplicative inverse or the reciprocal. And we flip the second fraction and multiply instead of divide. Okay. So we're going to use, let's see, the division property of equality here. Only remember, when we're using fractions, we don't actually divide. We take the second term and we flip it. We change the operation, and then we flip the second term. Remember, keep, which is right here, keep, change, we change the operation, flip, and we flip the second term. All right, but whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So we did keep, change, flip over here also. This is like the middle of our balance. Everything we do to one side, we have to do to the other to keep it in balance. All right, so another chapter 2 skill. We can cross cancel. The 2's cross cancel and make 1's. The 3's cross cancel and make 1's. I now have 1 times n, because all of this is 1, which is n. 1 times n is n. Now I go ahead and multiply. 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 2 is 8. So n equals 3/8. That's the solution for this problem. All right, so we just use the inverse operation to isolate the variable, get it by itself, and then that's our solution. The multiplication property of equality. If you multiply both sides of an equation by the same number, the two sides will remain equal. In other words, anything you do to one side, you have to do to the other, and it will remain equal or in balance. Okay, so here we have 12 divided by 4 equals 3. So we're going to multiply both sides by 4 to get rid of that division problem, which now that makes a 1. So now we have 12 left over. 1 times 12 left over. There's our 1. Time equals 4 times 3, which is 12. So 12 equals 12. Therefore, it's still in balance. All right. A biologist divides a water sample equally among 8 test tubes. Each test tube contains 24.5 milliliters of water. Write and solve an equation to find the volume of the water sample. So each test tube, that's a really great drawing. Each test tube has 24.5 milliliters, and there's 8 of these. 6, 7, 8. Okay, so what we're trying to find out is to find out how much there is if we have all of them. All right, how much water? Write an equation, let V represent the volume in milliliters. The volume divided by 8 equals the volume in each test tube. All right, so this is the total volume of all 8 of them. Then divide it by 8 because there are 8 of them. Each of them has 24.5 milliliters. So we want to find out what the total amount is. In order to do that, we're going to multiply both sides. We're going to do the inverse operation. Right here, we've got division going on. So this time, we're going to use the multiplication property of equality, which is our inverse operation. We're going to multiply both sides by the 8 because we want to make a 1, get that V by itself. So V equals 8 times 24.5. I don't know that off the top of my head. Maybe you do. 8 times 4 is 32, plus 4 more is 36, 3, 16, 19. Okay, and then I have a decimal, so I need to move the decimal over. So I have, the volume is 196 milliliters. So if all of these have 24.5, if I wanted to add this all up, it would, this total is 196 milliliters of water in all 8 test tubes. So the volume of the water sample is 196 milliliters. All right, let's do a couple more on the next page just to see how this is going to work in our practice. All right, here we go. We have 2.5 milliliters equals 10. So we're going to, this is multiplication going on. So we're going to do the inverse operation, which is division. We're going to divide both sides by 2.5 because that's the number next to the variable. We divide both sides by 2.5, which is using the division property of equality. So what does m equal? Because we made a 1 here. Now m's by itself. Let's go over here and divide this out. So 2.5, we get the decimal out of the divisor, which means we also have to move it in the dividend as well. And so 25 goes into 100 4 times, right? Just like quarters, there's 4 quarters in a dollar. So m equals 4. Okay, let's do one more. I'm gonna skip this one. I'm gonna do this one because I don't want this to throw us. We don't divide by 2.8. We're dividing by 4 because 4 is next to the variable. So we divide both sides by 4. That makes our 1. So t is our final solution. Let's go over here. 4 goes into 2.8 0 times, but it does go into 28 7 times. All right, so t equals 0.7, and so on. All you do is the inverse operation. So down here, you're going to multiply both sides by 5 to get the variable by itself, and so on. All right, let's take a quick look at our notes, which you also will get a picture of in the Google Classroom. Okay, so we solve multiplication and division inequalities. We use the inverse operations to isolate the variable. We make a 1. That's the whole goal, is to make a 1. Determine the operation being used. Here it's multiplication. Determine the inverse operation. It would be division, so we're going to divide by 14, isolate the variable. Down here, again, this is multiplication, but we don't divide fractions. We're working with a fraction. We don't divide fractions. Instead, we use the multiplicative inverse. Go back to lesson 2.7 if you don't remember this. We make a 1, multiply this out, we get n equals 2/3, or 3/8. I don't know where 2/3 just came from. 3/8. Okay, good luck.